Energy across the pond. This is Energy Matters with Claire
and Dan.
All right, so today's episode, we're going to talk about what's going on with energy broadly between Europe and the United States. So Dan, why don't you tell us a little bit about why the geography of these two places make a difference?
Well, a couple basic features. One is that the U.S. is just very big and very, very underpopulated by European standards, although overall they're not so different in population. But the U.S. has very concentrated East Coast and very, very concentrated West Coast, a little bit like Europe, but we have a vast expanse, bigger than much of what we see in Europe. And so that does matter a lot. But I would say the other piece of geography that matters greatly is the underground geography. And that is that Europe has been, and depending how you count it, still is very dependent on fossil fuels, particularly gas from Russia.
Right.
And the U.S. is now the world's largest exporter of fossil fuels, which seems so weird to say.
It seems so weird to say because as I understand in 2023, fossil fuels accounted for about 70% of the energy consumed in Europe. And the EU relied on imports for 58% of its primary energy needs, correct?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the U.S. has, under this current administration, really abandoned all energy and climate sensibility, has not attended the climate conference of the parties that just concluded in Brazil, and is really off the rails from any perspective of caring about the planet or our neighbors.
Right. And so tell us, just for those who aren't familiar, a little bit about the fracking sort of innovation that's happened in the last 10, 15 years, which has made the United States a net exporter.
Yeah, so all the talk in the 70s and 80s with the oil embargoes, and we're so vulnerable to OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. The U.S. is now the number one member of OPEC without being a
Which
member.
Is
because
crazy.
During the last 2 decades, the U.S. has discovered fracking, which really means fracturing rock to extract oil and in particular gas. And so now the U.S. is a net exporter, and the current president has leaned into that with this so-called energy dominance strategy that sort of just codified a lot that was going on already under prior presidents, Democratic and Republican. But what it means is that heartland U.S., the economics of fracking are good, even if fracking itself is not sustainable. And that's ironic that in many of the big fracking areas, they also happen to be big wind power areas. So it's a weird mixture of things all happening at once. So I guess my question for you in the business side is that as someone who's gone to school in Europe, who has done deals there, when you look at kind of the financial landscape of getting things done in the U.S. versus Europe, what's your kind of top 3 or top 5 list of things that you just do differently either side of the pond?
A number of things. One, politics matter a lot and policy matters a lot. So in the United States, prior to Donald Trump, we were, relying upon capitalism working, and the fact that if you applied to get a permit for something, you actually were going to get it. So as an example, in 2014, U.S. Wind purchased a lease to be able to finance and install wind power off the coast of Maryland. Now we know that tax credits have changed completely, and Interior Secretary Doug Burgum is trying to pause the construction of a number of plants, including Revolution Wind, which was 80% complete in January of 2024, and all of a sudden, Secretary Burgum is pausing its construction, citing national security concerns. So, makes absolutely no sense. But historically, I would argue that we relied on policy staying the way that it was. Going back to sort of the geography issue, thinking through, what is a differentiator between Europe and the United States. In Europe, you have folks who are more socialistic, and they believe that people have the right to clean water and clean air and are willing to pay for that. Right.
And we just let the rich pay for it and everyone else gets dirty.
Right. Exactly. So, for example, in Germany, you saw in the 70s, 80s, 90s, solar energy in Germany makes very little sense in the sense that the solar installation rate or the number of kilowatt hours that you're actually generating per kilowatt installed is very low. Some people say that the solar installation rate is in Germany is about like what it is in Alaska. But for whatever reason, right, Germany has solar all over the place. What's that reason? Because there have been policies that have been set up to make solar power work in Germany, which leads me to the question of feed-in tariffs versus RPS. So why don't you tell us, Dan, what to our listeners what that means?
So, sort of the policies that were first pushed to really get solar out the door after the technology was available was really done by the Green Party in Germany. And that was a so called feed in tariff or FIT. And the idea of a feed in tariff is a mechanism to minimize bureaucracy, which I know bureaucracy in Germany, they're kind of good friends. But the idea was that we will have a series of bidding periods. And when we open a bidding period, the government will say, for everyone who signs up to put solar onto the grid, we're going to give you a 20-year fixed contract. We're going to pay you a specified amount. And at some points in the past, it was hugely lucrative, other times less so. But it was also such low paperwork that German Chancellor Angela Merkel used to love to go around to conferences and say, to get your solar system, whether you're a business or a homeowner, on the grid in Germany, you fill out, of course, online, this one piece of paper. And then she would find the biggest, heaviest book she could find and drop it. And since she's a former professor, it kind of comes with some academic weight. And she said, this is how much paperwork you have in the U.S. And she
It's true.
said, this
Yeah.
overcomes all of the poor insulation we have. We've made it easy to do so, and we give you 20 years certainty when you lock in that price. Now, some of those were just ridiculous. The price they were giving out was 6 times what the market price was. And so
Right.
some right-wing Germans complained, but that mechanism spread. It spread to Southeast Asia. It spread to other parts of Europe and Latin America. Meanwhile, the U.S. had a state by state thing called a renewable portfolio standard. There was a famous point in time when the state of Maine had an RPS of 35%, but they counted fossil gas, natural gas, counted as a renewable. Not anymore,
Oh,
thankfully.
well, and that's still happening. In Maryland, the renewable portfolio standard means that it could be waste heat and
It's
you could be
right,
burning waste in order to get the value of renewables.
right.
So, but the renewable portfolio standard in the US has been complicated because each state and each utility feels like it's its own special snowflake. So, the renewable portfolio standard in Maryland, which I helped create, was a solar carve out, right? There are solar carve outs in some states, but not in others. So, different policies have created different things, right? I would argue, however, that there are some states in the United States that are leaning more towards feed in tariffs, like Massachusetts. They have the Solar Massachusetts Renewable Target or SMART program, which provides monthly payments for solar energy productions, which is much more like a feed in tariff. So you're selling electricity back to the utility, which makes a
Yeah, and
lot of sense.
I would say smart is smart because the price that you need to incentivize solar versus wind versus geothermal versus more efficiency in the states that actually include that are different. So this famous German policy from the 80s and 90s that Hermann Scheer, a member of parliament, created is a more flexible tool. It does come with this lock-in. Once you get it, the state can't take it away for its 20 years. So differences in structure, and certainly the bare pun intended behind the story was Europe was trying very hard to minimize their overwhelming dependence on Russian gas. And so these strategies made sense even for low insulation. The US run the other way, but at the same time, then we have places like California that are now 70% powered by clean energy, and they're exporting clean energy to neighboring states now over 110 days in a row. So the policy mechanisms can work in the U.S., and I would say some of them have really worked well. Massachusetts, New Mexico, Washington. We'll see how the Maryland one that you set up really plays out because Maryland is now building both solar and gas, which to my mind says they have not figured out, which way is their head pointing.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I would say in Europe, however, the discussion is much less about climate and much less about clean and making sure that people have access to clean air and clean fuel. It has a lot more to do about reducing dependence on Russia for fossil fuels, right? Europe has had a heavy reliance on Russia for fossil fuels for forever, right? My guess, Dan, even though you and I are both climate diehards, is that the conversation is much more about independence and less dependence on Russia.
It is, but I think that's something that has been interesting to watch, especially for me during the 20 years when sort of Europe came out of nowhere on clean energy and really rocketed to very interesting policies, is that solar always seemed like the obvious winner where I was in the US West. And it's not a winner in Europe, but it is part of the policy that we just talked about. But wind makes so much sense. And so Europe now has excellent onshore wind and is also a global leader along with China in offshore wind, whereas the US today gets precisely zero energy from offshore wind.
Right. And,
Right.
Based on this administration, that will continue to be the case. Right.
That's right. But it's
Yeah.
interesting. So in the last administration, I would argue when the U.S. actually had a government under President Biden, with the Inflation Reduction Act, European companies, some of which had done some quick rebranding. So the two big Norwegian companies, Statoil and Statkraft, which are basically parastatal companies to do energy infrastructure and oil and gas. One of them rebranded themselves Equinor because it sounded green. And they were all lined up to install offshore wind systems and to build hydrogen hubs on the U.S. coast. And they've all gone back to Europe and said, we don't need the uncertainty and the drama that the U.S. is providing because they can't seem to make up their mind. And so
Right.
some of the players that could really have advanced it at low cost in the U.S. just gave us the finger, as they should, because we flip-flopped from being as smart as we could be, I would say, as green under President Biden, to this just horrific anti-energy, anti-climate policy we're seeing now under the current administration.
Well, so that leads me to the question of nuclear, right? So let's discuss nuclear. So as we know, France is 77% nuclear powered, right?
65 today, it was
65.
77. Yeah.
Okay, 65
Yeah.
today. All right. And Germany is 0% powered by nuclear, but for what they import from France, correct?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So I guess the way I think of it is that Germany and California both cheat in the same way. So under Governor Brown, the first time he was governor, he said California will not build any new nuclear plants until we have a solution for waste. Germany watched what happened in first Chernobyl and then Fukushima and said nuclear is out of the equation. California then very quietly imports nuclear power from Arizona, from the Four Corners nuclear plant. And Germany imports, it varies year to year, but up to about 7.5% of their energy in the form of nuclear from France. So we both do nuclear by wire. And so nuclear policies vary around the country. New York State, the U.S. Southeast, strong interest in nuclear. Tennessee Valley Authority, strong interest in nuclear. And again, Europe is this kind of patchwork, some in, some out. And some of the most expensive nuclear plants to build in history have been in Europe, where a decade and a half behind schedule and 5 times over initial cost are some of the most recent plants that have been built. So it's a weird landscape.
Well, it's a weird landscape. So, just to back up for a second, I think nuclear power generates somewhere between 18 and 20% of the United States electricity countrywide, right?
Right.
And this figure has been constant over time, supplying about a fifth of the nation's electricity. But going back to your point about nuclear being over budget and over time, that it takes much longer. I mean, that's the case with every nuclear power plant from the beginning of time in the United States as well.
That's right. Although now we're seeing South Korea and China and others building nuclear plants that so far are actually on time and under budget. But what we don't know is this an apples to apples comparison? Because in France, in other parts of Europe, certainly in Russia and in the U.S., we have old nuclear plants, and old nuclear plants are more expensive to upgrade and to keep current than new ones are. We'll find out if these cheap Asian nuclear plants remain cheap or if their prices rise significantly as they get older as well. So we don't have enough data, but certainly almost every billionaire in the US has put a bet on small modular nukes or a fast gas plant or a uranium thorium plant. And so there may well be a huge nuclear renaissance. And both Presidents Biden and what we have today in the US are both very strongly pro nuclear.
So, okay. So tell me though, why is France 65% nuclear versus us still being 20% nuclear?
Well, I think that France did something interesting that the U.S. didn't take on. And there's a lot of different pieces, but I think the simplest one is that France decided to standardize the design and standardize the jobs. And so you could move from one nuclear plant to another in France, and there was a job waiting for you because they chose a somewhat less efficient but a very robust design. The United States, essentially, each one is a craft built battleship where each nuclear plant has its own unique features, even if the core is bought from a small set of companies, from Westinghouse, from a couple others. The plants themselves are very different. And so the same sort of standardization, both on the hardware side, but more importantly on the management and the regulation side, just never came together in the US. And hence that 18, 19% sort of peak. And I guess for me, the worry is, and we talked about it a little bit in the nuclear episode before, and that is that every single nuclear plant in the world today has to be retired by 2050.
Yep.
And so unless this huge wave of building cheaper, safer nuclear plants actually happens, so-called Generation 4, nuclear share, in my view, is likely to go down, whereas the people investing, of course, think that it's kind of a bright new day, and the nuclear of tomorrow will be totally differently managed than the nuclear of today. And that same story has divided Europe, where Germany says we can get there with solar, wind, imported hydro from Norway. We don't need Russian gas. We're going to zero out the French nuclear eventually, but not during the term of any current elected official, because that would probably spike rates. And with the war going on in Ukraine, you don't need a spike over gas and a spike over nuclear at the same time.
Right, at the same time. Yeah. And meanwhile, back on this side of the pond, my understanding is the U.S. government inked a partnership with the Canadian owners of Westinghouse in October of 2025 that aims to build at least $80 billion in nuclear reactors. So
that's right.
To your point, there's lots of people that are investing in nuclear.
So when we think about nuclear and who's investing, it's not just governments, of course. The so-called FANG companies, the
Exactly.
Facebooks, Apples, Netflix, and others, they are all doubling down on nuclear because it's part of their portfolio to build data centers and data servers, but to bring their own generation. And so we've seen Google and others doing several $billion at a shot investments. And so the appetite to build out nuclear is there. The U.S. does not have the same levels of regulation that we see in Europe. And so I guess one of the things that does come up as a constant theme is that while the policies in Europe, I would say, started slower, except for Germany, we now have Ireland and the UK very, very much in the lead in terms of wind, electric vehicles, clever policies, so-called fee-bates, or a fee and a rebate put together so that you can invest in clean and get some benefits out of it. And we're seeing a lot of really clever, socially motivated policies across Europe. And socially motivated is not a term that we use in the U.S. during the current administration.
Isn't that the truth? Yeah. But my understanding is the U.S. government's established a goal to triple nuclear energy generating capacity by 2050 and add 35 gigawatts of new capacity.
Exactly. And I guess the irony there is that's the only piece of Biden's Sunny Lands agreement with China that this government has latched onto. Tripling renewables is out, tripling nuclear is in.
To continue the energy dominance agenda, right?
Oh, my goodness. Yeah.
Including signing an executive order and an $80 billion deal with Westinghouse to build new large nuclear reactors, right?
Exactly. Now, a lot of people, of course, think those big reactors are interesting, but it's the commercially driven idea for small reactors, the SMRs that we talked about before, that are going to make people a lot of money. So we'll see what's a winner or loser. I guess for me, if I had a concluding comment, it's that it's clear that the U.S. that we can't get to a climate goal unless the U.S. and China work together to some degree. But it's also true that we can't get there unless Europe continues to lead, because the U.S. has proven so far to be incredibly fickle on its policy landscape.
Isn't that the truth? Yep. I think that's a good place to conclude. There's so much more to discuss. But thank you for listening. Check out energymatters.world to learn more. This is Energy Matters with Claire and Dan. Thanks so much for listening.